You know, you're right. I've been here before, and I'm fundamentally different in 1990 than 1996 in a number of ways, which I'll get to. But I think in 2012, New Hampshire needs leadership for a change in the governor's office. We need someone who is a committed conservative, at least committed conservative in the New Hampshire tradition about what works for our state, and is willing to be a leader in the governor's office. And I think we have an opportunity in New Hampshire to really distinguish ourselves as the best state to do business, the best state to raise a family, and the best state to live. And we have some quality indicators so far that are trending in the right direction, but there's a lot of angst in the economy. People around the state tell me, whether they're business owners or employees, about their anxiety over the future of our economy here in New Hampshire as well as nationally. And I see the role of governor as really being a two-part role. One is the manager of the state government, overseeing the executive branch and bringing experience to that position. And secondly, it's really to lead the state as the ambassador for New Hampshire in terms of branding our state, promoting it regionally, developing an economic development plan that is statewide, and then putting in place government reforms that make it easier for people to do business in New Hampshire. Because this is all about jobs, and that's what I hear around the state. So in running in 2012, I'm running from the business perspective. When I ran for governor in 1996, I was chairman of the State Board of Education. I did not have the kind of leadership experience that I've had since. Since 1996, I've become a member of, I've been an owner of our law firm, and actually been part of the management team of one of the state's largest law firms. Worked as a business lawyer for 26 years, but the last 20 of them, or 16 years, I've been involved with the leadership of our firm. And I bring real-world business experience, not just as an owner of a business, and I understand what it takes to run a business. And the fact is that business owners don't get paid until everyone else in the business is paid, beginning with the facilities manager or the janitor and the receptionist on over to the paralegals and associates in our firm. But I've also had a chance to serve as chairman of St. Mary's Bank, the nation's first credit union, a $750 million financial institution, which provides commercial lending products as well as mortgages and financial products for families and so forth. And I've had a chance to work in the private sector in at least that economic environment dealing with commercial lending. And access to capital is still an issue for New Hampshire, and it is nationally. Lending standards have tightened for business, and we don't have the access to capital that we need for startup businesses as well as for really relatively newly formed businesses. And so I bring that perspective to the governor's office that I did not have when I ran in 1996. I have another also 16 years of real life experience, having raised two daughters now. Our kids were pretty young when I ran. Now that we're empty nesters, my wife Betty and I are. And I've been involved with a number of civic and charitable organizations in terms of leadership positions that, again, I bring to the governor's office.
Before I kick it over to Kevin, just want to go back to one thing you said. You talked about leadership for a change.
Yes.
Is that a commentary on the current governor?
It's a double entendre. It is a commentary to the extent that I don't believe Governor Lynch has been the leader for New Hampshire that we've needed. He has been a good steward. If you have a natural disaster, fire, we've had flooding and so forth, the governor's been there. And he has been very good in working with the civic and charitable communities to appear at events that are important to the state. He's been accessible. And when I announced for governor, I said I'd like to be like Governor Lynch in that regard, of being someone who's accessible to the people. And I'll work across the aisle as well, as I believe he has in many ways in his governorship. But when it came to actually leading the state in terms of policy and initiatives, hi Terry, good to see you. The governor was not proactive, and he did not exercise, I think, the considerable leadership abilities that he has and had. He's probably the most popular governor in New Hampshire history based on the polling data. But when I worked, for example, on a constitutional amendment in education funding, the governor was very difficult to get to commit to a language that he could support, and he did not really proactively reach out to Democrats or even Republicans, for that matter, to bring together a coalition of people who could support putting on the ballot a constitutional amendment question, a very important question for the state of New Hampshire. And I've heard from a number of different people who have been involved with a number of initiatives like that. We're not really able to access the governor and have him exercise the kind of leadership we need, which is why, Nick, I've pledged to the people of New Hampshire that if I'm the governor, I'm going to sign or veto any bill that comes to me. And what that does is it puts the onus on me and my team to be mindful and aware of the bills that are coming through the legislature, and then to weigh in on them as the process works, and work with our legislative leadership, and not let them wait till the end of the process before I announce whether I'm going to let the bill pass without my signature, sign it, or veto it. And that's the kind of leadership people expect in New Hampshire. A hands-on governor who's willing to work with state leaders, both in government and in the private sector, and actually drive an agenda that makes sense for New Hampshire.
One of the things that John Lynch has talked about for 8 years is zero-based budgeting, and you talk about it in your campaign. How are you going to be any different than he was in terms of being able to accomplish any goal resulting from that?
Yeah, zero-based budgeting is an off-use term, and it means something different to different people. Let me tell you what I believe it means for me. And I know Governor Christie, for example, ran on zero-based budgeting in New Jersey, and he actually started implementing some changes in New Jersey. Not that I use New Jersey as a model for New Hampshire, but Governor Christie certainly is someone who's distinguished himself. And I think what we need to do is move away from the legal requirement. And a lot of people don't know this, but New Hampshire law requires this, and I know Kevin knows, a maintenance budget approach. RSA 9.4, as amended, says the executive branch agencies are supposed to propose a budget which will maintain the current or the status quo, a maintenance budget. And so you assume what's been doing the last 2 years or 20 years that you still are doing is what you should be doing the next 2 years. I think you need to sit down with executive branch agency heads and have them reconstruct the budget from the bottom up. Put together outcomes that you're trying to achieve in the course of the next 2 years. How many roads are we looking to resurface, or bridges we're looking to fix? And what is it going to take to do that based on the 10-year highway plan and so forth, just to use an example? And then what is it that we need in terms of resources? How many people do we really need to do this work? What about the infrastructure, the bureaucracy that we have to support that? Do we need as many people in middle management who are moving paper across the office? Or can we do it more efficiently with maybe an investment in infrastructure with our IT department, and then build that budget from bottom up, and then see where it takes us? And that's the kind of approach I want to take with our agency heads. I don't want to sit back and just let them develop something. I want to work with them and have our budget director be part of that process.
But do you think, as you know, Speaker O'Brien came here and said he thought in the next budget there's at least several $100 million we can take out of the budget we're operating under now.
Right.
Is that realistic? Or is there no way of knowing until you get there?
Well, Kevin, that's how I answered his question. The very first debate we had, John Burt sponsored it. It was back in the Radisson about 3 weeks ago. And the speaker was actually one of the panelists. And he asked me this question point blank. He said, do you think you can save $400 million off the budget so we can get to a round number of $10 million? I said, I don't know. And I don't presume to know the answer to that question until we go through a zero-based budgeting approach or reconstruct that budget and see what we need to be doing for the people based on our constitutional requirements, based on the statute, based on our existing programs, and challenge those programs, and then see where the numbers take us. And it's based on that we should lead to a conclusion that we can save money or reduce spending or, in other places, move our resources from one department to another. But I don't think you can just select a number a priori without the benefit of experience and planning and working with your budget leaders. My hope is to be able to level fund the government at best, at worst, and at best be able to find some savings that we can direct perhaps to other ways of lowering taxes. For example, lowering some of the burdens we're passing down to cities and towns.
I guess I think zero-based budgeting is a great concept, and I think it works in business to some degree. I question whether it can work in government because there's so many other political considerations that are in play,
right.
and it relates from certain people in certain jobs because they knew somebody or they've got this person as a sponsor. So you take away the veil of all of that, and perhaps it's possible, but I wonder if it's practical.
I think it has to be practical, and you have to approach it with from that perspective, that while there will be a different approach because it's government, and surely there are things that you might not do in business that you're going to have to do in government because of the requirements you have as a governmental entity. But the concept of challenging the status quo and saying there are no sacred cows, and we need to look at the delivery system is what this is about. And that's an important process we need to go through. And you know this as well as anyone, Terry, that government tends to become very bureaucratic and statist. So people say, well, that's the way we've always done it. Okay, well then is there a better way to do it? And are there different approaches to delivering this kind of service that we're having? You know, we're changing the delivery system now in terms of Medicaid, going to a managed care system. I don't know that that's going to save us real dollars. We don't know that. But we know we're challenging the way we've done business there in the past, and I'm hopeful that, in fact, we're going to see some real savings and real value back to the beneficiaries of the Medicaid program. That's the kind of approach we need to take across the board in government. That's really what I mean by zero-based budgeting.
Do you think, as some do, that some parts of state government should be combined to create more efficiency?
Yes.
Whether it's financial services or labor and insurance. What's your thoughts about that, or are we right-sized in terms of our state and how our bureaucratic structure is set up?
Yeah, that's the kind of work that I want to do if I'm elected from day one, which would be November 7th, to start working on transition planning, which would include meeting with the commissioners and so forth. We'll talk about whether it makes sense to continue to for example, and one of the things I want to do, if we're going to be a pro-business state, let's change the name of our marketing department from DREAD to something else. And you know, we've been doing this for a long time, and I hear this from other people, and I say, let's get serious about that. So here we've got economic development also taking care of other programs which may be related but may not be central to true business development. So you may say, let's look at maybe shifting some of the functions from out of the soon-to-be renamed DREAD, like, for example, state parks and so forth. Maybe that belongs in a different department. Maybe there's a way to really focus that department on business promotion, branding New Hampshire. We don't have a statewide economic development plan, which is not acceptable. And we should have one that looks to brand New Hampshire but also focus on the regional assets of our state as we move forward, because various regions of the state have different strengths and weaknesses to address. So, and they create opportunity. So I think we do want to look at how we're structured currently. And there needs to be consolidation, certainly in terms of back office support for the systems we have. And we do not have an integrated information technology system in New Hampshire like state government, like you do in most businesses now.
Could you talk a little bit about what you want to do with business taxes and regulation?
Right.
And I'm sure you've heard many times your opponent in this primary talk about your plan kind of tinkering around the edges and his plan sending a more significant message to the business community.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's important to to try to understand what we're dealing with here in terms of business taxation as a priority. If you were to look at the New Hampshire Bankers Association's survey earlier this year, which was published at the end of April, was conducted by Andy Smith of the UNH Survey Center. He interviewed or surveyed 400 businesses, large and small, across the state. And when you ask, and this is reported on page 11 of that report, the businesses about what are the obstacles to job creation and growth, business taxation is way down the line. You have the top three issues are uncertainty, economic uncertainty. Secondly, regulations. They've identified federal regulation, but I think the state regulation often mimics the federal regulation. Third thing is health care. So those are really the high, and then there are a couple other issues below that, but before you get to business taxation. So I think we want to be realistic about the business taxation approach. And we need to be reasonable and proportional about it. Last time I checked the Constitution, the governor's office is a 2-year term. And one legislature can't bind the next legislature and based on the laws that it passes over the course of that biennium. So to project where the rate's going to be 7 years down the road or whatever it is I think, I think it's exaggerating what is the possible and the reasonable. We should be lowering business profits taxes to the extent we can, pay for it, and that's what my plan calls for. Lowering our business profits tax from 8.5 to 8%. Over the 2 years, which sends a message to the business community we're trending in the right direction. Then we propose other changes in what I call the EASY plan, ESE plan, that looks to do things like encourage businesses to pay some or all of student loans and get a tax deduction for that off their business profits tax. Extend the net operating loss carry forward to be consistent with federal law, so it goes over 20 years. Make it simpler for filing of tax returns, and for companies that do business outside the state to use a sales factor for determining the business profits tax liability. And then to be able to allow businesses to collect over an unlimited period of time any BET credits. That's a practical approach to reforming our business profits tax system, our business tax system. And clearly we want to be at a lower level, but we understand that that has to be paid for as it goes. And so my plan calls for applying a pay-go approach. And that actually makes sense to me as a business person to say, if we're going to reduce revenues in the short term by a certain amount of money, where are we going to get the savings in terms of the budget to offset that? And that makes it a value calculation as to how quickly we move forward to lower taxes and what the cost is going to be in terms of a reduced government program. And that's the approach I'd like to take, and I will take.
But, I mean, obviously for the business community and members of it that are going to vote for or not for you in September and November, what are they getting?
In terms of the business profits plan, first of all, they're getting a leader who actually has been in business, actually been a business owner and been a business advocate for 26 years. So, and most of the business leaders in the state know me, and they know me personally, and I know them. And it takes nothing for me to pick up the phone and connect with them, and I've worked with them on a number of initiatives in the past. So they're getting somebody they can work with, and they know that. Secondly, they're getting someone who's going to be an advocate for business. And it's not just business taxation. I'll be an advocate for working with them to find the best approach to make our environment best for business to function and then to create jobs. And it's the private sector that does that. But one of the other things I'm going to do right the first day is to appoint a business advocate to the governor's office. You know, we have consumer services or citizen services and all. I want to appoint someone who's got experience in business to come into the governor's office and be the business advocate whose job it is to respond to businesses that have concerns or problems with state government, whether it's getting a permit or some paperwork approval or some bureaucrat that's giving them a hard time, and have that business advocate move very quickly to troubleshoot, to be almost an ombudsman, and then to have that person work with me to assemble a business advisory group so that business has direct communication and influence with the governor's office in terms of policies and initiatives that we can lead to a better business climate here in New Hampshire. I need to be a pro-business governor, and I will be. And every day I'm going to ask myself, what can I do today that's going to either bring in new business or make life better for business in New Hampshire?
How big of an obstacle are regulations in this state of business? What would you do about it?
Yeah, substantial. And the substantial, depending on the business you're in. So what I'll also do day one, Kevin, is to issue an executive order to put a 90-day moratorium on any new rules and regulations and to require our agency heads to conduct a true economic impact analysis to determine and project what the true cost is going to be to businesses as well as cities and towns or individuals to comply with the latest rules that are being proposed. And then to tell us what the value is, what is intended to be achieved by this latest set of rules that you're promulgating, and then to do a cost-benefit analysis. And if the values do not far outweigh the costs, go back to the drawing board and find out a better way to promulgate that latest rule and regulation. And then the next phase would be to have those agency heads identify rules that they propose to amend or repeal. We need to be moving into a more deregulated marketplace, and I think that we can do that. And it is everything from having a much simpler way for businesses to start by their filing requirements, going to one place, one-stop shopping for them, to compliance as they move forward, whether it's an automobile dealer and getting state approvals for their mechanics, to do state certification and so forth, state inspections rather, to be able to work more closely with government and be efficient about it. And that's going to be good for business. To the extent you don't have people spending a lot of time in terms of compliance, those people can be spending more time promoting sales or production or growing the business.
On that subject, it has nothing to do with taxes or anything of that nature, but it does have to do with reputation. And I think, based on conversations I've had with local business people, that the state took quite a hit in terms of its reputation because of the legislature's actions on things like gay marriage, the issue of tacking on abortion language onto business tax credit bill, things of that nature. And I was hearing from a lot of people saying, geez, this is really getting to be a sore spot with us because these issues really don't really have anything to do with business. And yet, New Hampshire's getting this reputation as being wacky on these types of issues. And I wonder if you have a business advocate, how is that person going to handle those issues, particularly since I suspect you support some of these things that, at least philosophically, that the legislature is pursuing.
Terry, I think you know this better than most people. You're involved in the community, and certainly with your business here, the Telegraph. You know that the way we do business is almost as important as what the business is about. And that's true for the legislative process. That's true for the way government functions. It's less about the issues that are before the legislature or the governor, and then it is about how we handle those issues. And I think we need to really look at those processes. And I want to work with our legislative leadership to make sure that we have an orderly flow of information, an orderly way to handle tough issues, so that people feel people coming in to testify don't feel like they're strangers in their own House of Representatives, that they actually welcome their citizens to give a contrary view, and that their votes are taken, and that there will always be some degree of tension within the legislative process, but there's a way to do business that's going to be much more, I think, balanced and appropriate for the citizens, and then therefore for New Hampshire as a state in terms of the perceptions we have. This is where leadership comes in too, and leadership abhors a void. And when there is not the kind of leadership, and we haven't had the kind of leadership in the corner office with this legislature that we needed, to try to work in a much more concerted way about prioritizing, and I'll start doing that right after the primary if I'm successful, setting an agenda that we're going to strive for and making us focused on that agenda, focused on getting things done that's going to be good for business and good for the state. And it's not going to be easy. I've worked in government. I know it's not easy. But I've had some experience now in leadership, and I understand what it takes to make us move forward in a business-like way. And people will draw inferences from what kind of state we are based on how we conduct our business. So I think every state deals with issues, social issues as well as economic issues, but the way we deal with them is as important as the issues themselves.
How would you characterize your relationship with Speaker O'Brien?
Good. It's a good relationship. I know the Speaker. I've worked with him in the past and worked with him on the educational funding amendment. We get along well. We may have a different approach or a different style, and I respect that. And he's got a different job. I mean, his is a legislative job. As governor, mine would be essentially a management and a leadership job, and not a policy-making job in the legislative sector other than the things that I really want to champion with them. And so his work is to organize a caucus around party identification, and that's tough when you've got, especially in this first year, we had so many newly elected state representatives who all ran very hard in their districts, and they all had an issue they were running on, and they felt that they had a mandate to go in and tackle X issue or Y issue. So I think the next session we'll see I think a different approach. Certainly if I'm the governor, we'll work together from the get-go to make sure that we have an orderly process. And I have a good, like I say, working relationship with the Speaker, and I think we'll be able to maintain that.
One of the concerns we're hearing is that the state is increasingly having trouble hanging on to its young people, where in previous decades, this is a place where young people wanted to go.
Yes.
Now we're seeing an exodus.
Right.
As governor, what would you do to try and stop that?
Well, I am concerned about that too, Phil. I left the state to teach and then to go to law school and came back after about 10 years of being away between going to college in Washington and then coming back here. I chose to come back to New Hampshire. I was visiting a business yesterday, and there was a junior in college who was working as for a summer job in this business, a manufacturing business. And I said to him, "So when you're done college, you're going to come back here and work here?" And he said, "No way." I said, "What do you mean, no way?" He said, "I want to go somewhere else." I said, "Where do you want to go?" He said, "Like a big city." He said, "I've lived in this little town all my life, and I wanted something different." I said, when you're married and you have children, or if you have children, where would you like to be?" He said, "I'd like to be near a big city." I said, "How about New Hampshire? near Boston. He said, I think we'll come back here. And so I sense that with the young people, there's always been this sense that, we're a small state and people want to go out for reasons of life experience and all. But we should still be the state that people want to come back to in the end to raise their families. To the extent, however, we have people who, the best way to keep our young people here is to have good jobs for them, which is why jobs is such an important focus. But also to align the interests of business and education through like a Learn to Earn program, which I'm promoting, will assure that we can retain some talent in this way. If a company like BAE is projecting they're going to need a certain number of engineers in a particular specialty area, to use this vehicle as a public-private scholarship program, essentially, where what would happen is BAE would meet with, let's say, UNH officials and say, we are looking for this skilled worker in this engineering degree. And BAE would make an investment of some scholarship monies up front, and for, let's say, for 2 years scholarship, if it's those junior and senior years, so they know they'll have that student in 2 years out, that student agrees to work at BAE, and BAE commits to providing them a job, and to stay here as long as they've had a scholarship, like an ROTC type program. There's a win-win here. There's a win in terms of aligning the interests of education and business, working together, and retaining the talent that's here, and then giving those students the ability to actually know, and their parents to know there's actually a light at the end of the tunnel, and they'll have a job. Again, in this manufacturing company, they don't need college degreed students. They need workers who have, degrees in some manufacturing skills. And I had described this program to the owner. He said, I'd love that program because that would help me a lot. I spend a lot of time trying to recruit people. I train them here. I'd much rather partner with a local community college and tell them what it is that I'm looking for in terms of skill set. I know they must have programs that would help us. And then we can identify people that we could bring back here. So I think that kind of partnership is going to be part of this. And then lastly, the business proposal that I'm advocating will allow businesses to pay part of the tuition costs or a student loan, and hopefully that will incentivize some people that look to New Hampshire talent to pay that down so that they would students would stay here.
What do you see the nature of higher education being in the state 5 years from now? Are you seeing a shift away from places like UNH to a community college?
That's what I'm sensing right now, that there will be more of a focus, a targeted focus on manufacturing, particularly advanced manufacturing, where you might not need a 4-year degree, you might need a 2-year degree or 1-year degree, a 1-year certificate. Because I've met now several business owners. I've launched this jobs tour called Conversation on the Economy, who are having a hard time finding skilled workers in some of the trades. Some of the vocational schools that used to offer training in various trades don't do it anymore. And I'm hearing pretty consistently that there's a concern by employers, manufacturing employers, that guidance counselors in high school are encouraging a 4-year college path when there's a lot of opportunity, good paying jobs, and in a different path. And I think we need to work more strategically with those guidance counselors to educate them about what the opportunities are and stop looking down our nose at people who don't go to 4-year college degree programs, but rather go to 2-year or 1-year post-high school degree programs to learn a trade. I was yesterday visiting at a truck company that both sells trucks as well as repairs them. They have the same issue. They have a recruitment process where they go around the country to find people to come in and work as mechanics. And today's mechanic is not simply somebody who knows how to use a wrench. These are people using very sophisticated technologies to diagnose problems with emissions and everything from under the hood. And these are sophisticated jobs, and they're good-paying jobs. So we need to educate people about what's out there for them.
This legislature can take a real hard view of funding for UNH.
Yes.
Big cut. I mean,
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Do you think that was too big a cut? Do you think it was appropriate? What would your position be?
Well, Phil, I would like not to have to cut monies to higher education. On the other hand, given the budgetary constraints that they were working under, it's probably where they had to look. But I'd like to see us do a couple things. First of all, look at the delivery system of higher education, and the Chancellor's office is one of those easy places to look to see whether or not the bureaucracy has really gotten too big. And do we need to pay money for some of the things that's happening in the Chancellor's office? Secondly, look at the delivery system at the 4-year colleges as it is. What kind of bureaucracy do we have there? Where are some efficiencies that are available? And I've had a chance to meet now with President Huddleston as well as President Steen at Columbus State University. I'm impressed with what they've been able to do given the limited resources that they receive from the state. In terms of the overall budget, the state of New Hampshire has never been a big contributor to higher education as it is. So scholarship focus, I think everyone agrees, is one of the ways to try to support our higher educational system by allowing students to enter. When I was in Wyoming, there was a program that the University of Wyoming offered, which is that any high school student who received a high school degree was automatically admitted to the first year of college, or community college, or four-year college. Had an automatic admission. I'd like to look at something like that. It would help to keep our high school students here and see if we can't find support for those students to choose to stay in New Hampshire. Recognizing that a lot of students do want to go elsewhere, but to the extent we can work directly with our high schools to try to find a way to have our students enter our own schools, I think would be advantageous for us. But it isn't simply the dollars, it's also reforming the delivery system for higher education.
Do you think the state's or the lawmakers' attitude over the year and not being a big contributor to higher education here is the right one?
Well, you know, it's a function of priorities, and it's a function of resources that's available. We definitely need a robust educational system for our state. We've been the beneficiary of having some great institutions, Dartmouth College being one of them in Hanover. A lot of people will come to New Hampshire because they spent time going to school there. The retired citizens have come back because they wanted to be in New Hampshire where they went to college. So it's a great magnet for us. Our own college and university system in New Hampshire, both private and public, is an important economic engine for our state in terms of the monies it generates and on a number of levels. And so that in and of itself is a sector. So investment in the sector is important. But it is in the end a user-driven system, where people making an investment for those children in terms of paying tuition costs to go to four-year or two-year colleges, and again, both in the private and the public sector. So when you have an array of demands on state government, you have to put things in priority. The disabled population of our state, for example, is really one of the high priority sectors. Higher education is important, but it's probably pales by comparison to some of those other important functions. So it's an allocation of resources issue as far as I'm concerned. But in the end, when it comes to the public university system, it's about the delivery system itself. Are we as efficient as we should be? And I would just share anecdotally that when I visited Southern New Hampshire University during the course of the campaign and met with Paul LeBlanc, the president there, he's launched a very robust online educational program that has gone international, and he's been recognized for his creativity. He said to me, Ovid, if I were the president of a public university or college, I could never do what I've done here because of the bureaucracy they have to deal with. And I said, you know what? We ought to be looking then at our delivery system so that a public college or university could do what you've just done here. And we can learn from each other. And I think in fact, I know from meeting with the college presidents that they find that in New Hampshire there's a much higher degree of integration and collaboration between the private universities and colleges and the public ones than there is in other states, where there's really quite a schism between the two groups. And we're fortunate in that regard here in New Hampshire.
You had mentioned several of the quality of life indicators that make New Hampshire a great place to be. Some of the indicators where we're not so great.
Yeah.
Highest two-year tuition in the nation, highest four-year tuition, highest debt load for graduates, lowest assistance to higher education. So what do you do about that?
Well, you look at how we're performing, and you say to yourself, are our classrooms filled? Do people still come here? What do they get for the program that they've enrolled in? And our system is functioning, even though we do have those numbers. We'll try to be better about it. But again, I don't want to overpromise something that we can't deliver, and that is to just put more money into an existing system. I think we need to be looking at the delivery side here first and putting pressure there, and then seeing what we can do to augment support for higher education. The governor eliminated the unique program. I think we need to restore that program. The unique scholarship program is a way of encouraging investment and savings, and rather than raiding the fund, we should continue to find ways, again, to provide tuition support for what is admittedly a high tuition cost for our colleges and universities.
What about education K through 12? Given we're not going to have an amendment to the Constitution for some time, what should school districts, communities expect with a Governor Lamontagne for the next 2 years? The same level of support to cities and towns, or not?
Well, as a former chairman of the State Board of Education and a former teacher myself, I'm very interested in K through 12, and I have a lot of passion for it. I want to be hands-on as well with working with our educational leaders to see where the opportunities are in New Hampshire as well in terms of the delivery system, not just simply looking at dollars and cents, but looking at this kind of system we have. And let's admit the fact that our system for delivering education was designed after World War I, where our men and women who were in uniform and went to fight the Great War came back and said, you know what, we're not as educated in our state as they were in other states. And so we changed our system. We developed the State Board of Education system with school administrative units and so forth to deal with essentially an educational system of the 1920s. And that system continues in large part. I think we need to move to a site-based management system where we don't have as much bureaucracy through the SAUs. Does it make sense in today's economy, with today's information, that the superintendent of schools is who hires the teachers of a particular school, especially in a large school district, or SAU, like a single district SAU like Manchester or Nashua, and you've got a number of different schools? Why isn't the principal the educational leader of that school, rather than the superintendent being the educational leader and the principal being essentially the building administrator? I think the principal should be the de facto and in fact, and that law leader of that school. And that means we need to be looking at ways of restructuring our school administrative unit system. I think it should be back office support through perhaps larger and a lot fewer SAUs, and then to move to a site-based management approach. And then also look to what are the obstacles for true education in the classroom. No Child Left Behind, I submit to you, was a mistake, a Republican mistake and a Democratic mistake. And in the sense that we're requiring teachers to spend more time on testing to standards that were set by Washington, essentially. And then having our schools, our states and our schools, spend that kind of effort and resource in taking away from what they should be doing in the classroom day in and day out. And then I support alternative education. School choice is important. I'm glad that the legislature passed the educational scholarship opportunity for our students and our families to access alternative forms of education. I still think there's a lot of promise in charter schools. I worked with Senator Rubins and Representative Nils Larson and Governor Merrill back in 1994, 1995. When we passed the charter school legislation, it was the first education reform measure of any significance since that early 1920s restructuring of education in New Hampshire. So I would hope that people of New Hampshire would understand, and particularly the teachers, that I'm an advocate for good school practices, for supporting what's happening locally, but I believe in local control over the educational enterprise, and that's what we want to try to strive for. In terms of funding, we're going to have to work with a statewide property tax for at least the foreseeable future. We're going to maintain that, I think, in terms of its current level of funding. I'm concerned that there may be a lawsuit down the road that challenges that level of funding as inadequate. But I think for the moment we have a system that at least has achieved some level of equilibrium, so we're not creating a donor town and a recipient town mechanism like we had a few years ago. And I'm going to continue to work on a constitutional amendment. I think we can get there. And 2014 may be the best year to actually have the people vote on that. Because in the end, it's about local control. And that's what the constitutional amendment would afford, with targeted aid and the language I think you saw in the constitutional amendment that I supported with Jean Van Loan and Chuck Douglas and the Senate President and the Speaker and the Governor, ultimately, was a balanced approach to restoring that local control, but yet retaining on the part of the state an obligation to provide targeted aid.
And when you were on the state board, you kind of led that effort to send back monies from Goals 2000. Would you do that with No Child Left Behind? Should the state of New Hampshire turn down that money?
I think every federal program, whether it's education or not, you have to look at what you're getting in return for that. again, return of your own dollars, taxpayer dollars. And in the case of Goals 2000, we concluded that the money that was being offered and what we were required to do with it wasn't worth it, wasn't worth adding extra level of bureaucracy. And I would submit to you that even though New Hampshire ultimately went with Goals 2000 following the 1996 election, there was no educational improvement that we saw from that. But what we see is a bureaucracy that's in the State Department of Education that's essentially, as Elizabeth Toomey had told me, at that time was Assistant Commissioner of Education, Deputy Commissioner, she said, when I asked her, how many people work here in the State Department of Education? She said about 300. I said, how many of these people can we deploy into helping school districts where they need teacher education or curriculum development or some other help at the school level? How many of them can we deploy in the community? She says, are you kidding? She says, we can't deploy any of these people. We're a federal outpost, don't you understand? And all of these people work in whole or in part for the federal government in overseeing federal grant programs of all types. I was shocked by that, actually. I thought we had a lot more discretion, and we don't. And so, Kevin, what I would say to you is we need to move away from a dependency on the federal government, and to the extent we can get block-granted funds so we can develop the delivery system that works for New Hampshire, that's the way we should move. And I would certainly push back on the federal government on education. And I certainly would demand that the federal government meets its commitment under the IDEA. The fact that we have never challenged Washington, and if we have to bring a lawsuit to require Washington under the Act to fund its full share, 40% special education costs, and they're at 17% now. And they've never come close to that 40% commitment. Why do we just take that and just accept that as a fact when the law is supposed to obligate the federal government to that kind of a level of match, and it never has honored that commitment? And we've gone back to Congress. I testified in Congress about this back in the 90s. Charlie Bass took this on as an issue, but we've never seen results. We need to start being smart about where we put our resources and making sure the government, to the extent it's working with us, is meeting its obligations.
So would bringing such a lawsuit be a priority of your administration?
It would be if that's the only recourse we have.
What about expanded gambling?
Yeah. My view is this. We should look at expanded gaming from the point of view of economic development for a region, not additional revenues to the state. Although to the extent there are revenues brought, we should be using that not to raise general funds, but to lower existing commitments like I-93 widening, or perhaps providing more funds for a targeted aid program for schools, to lower property taxes, or some other dedicated purpose, maybe reducing some of the business taxes. My view is that we've allowed this gaming issue to get out of control because we haven't had the leadership to say, what would you do if New Hampshire were a corporation? And you know what you would do if New Hampshire were a corporation and you wanted, and a community or part of your corporation, a division said, we want to use this additional activity, slot machines is what it comes down to expand our operation. You'd say, does it make sense? Where does it make sense to do it? And you make a decision. And my view is this. There's only one place that we should look at, and that's Rockingham Park. Rockingham has been, over 100 years, the gaming center for New Hampshire. And it's been the place that we've had activities there, whether it's horse racing or other now, essentially a full casino without the slot machines in terms of charity gaming. The facility is there. It's proximate to the population of Massachusetts. And it makes sense for me to say to the people of New Hampshire, while I don't want gambling throughout New Hampshire, if a bill comes to me that targets Rockingham as the place that expanded gambling would occur and has the proper controls in it, I would support that. But it has to be there, and it has to start there. And if there's going to be any expansion beyond that, it has to be after we've tested the system, we know the system is working, we see what the adverse effects are, and people say, well, we're going to have a lot higher crime and so forth. Let's evaluate it there. But that's where it should be. And beyond that, we take it down the road as to whether or not there's an interest in doing something different elsewhere. But for this purpose, that's an economic development issue, and the community of Salem has supported it by a large margin in the past. I assume they would support it again. We should make sure they do continue to support that. But that should be the way we go on expanded gaming.
Do you have any concerns about the social impact of it? I mean, that's where we hear a lot about.
Yes, I do, and that's why the legislation would have to deal with that. And then in terms of practice, as it was brought online, we'd have to see what the consequences are, what really is happening on the ground here in New Hampshire, and then to make a decision as to whether or not this is working or isn't. What other changes would we make before we'd even consider another site? I think as I go around the state and I talk about this, even people who are generally opposed to expanding gaming, and I would say I am, say, all right, a Rockingham solution, I could live with that. That's where gaming is happening now, and it's where our state has always had gaming. So, you know, we could tolerate that.
Commuter rail.
I think commuter rail has to stand on its own in the end. I do believe, I don't close the door to commuter rail, but I also don't want to promise more than we can deliver. And so if there's a way to develop a public-private partnership with the federal government's involvement to look at infrastructure improvement that would, for example, take the rail up to Nashua, which is part of the proposal that people considered, and the numbers work so that it could sustain itself down the road, not operationally. That it definitely has to sustain itself operationally, but the infrastructure costs, I could see that public-private partnership. Then I would be open to it. But I think it's one of those infrastructure improvements that has to stand on its own in terms of the merits.
Yeah, that might be the first public transportation system that did stand on its
Mm-hmm.
merits, though.
So isn't that a no? I mean, are you basically saying no?
Well, and maybe a
And
no
was the
right
executive
now.
council correct to not go forward with the study, having worked several years to obtain federal money to do so?
Yeah, no, I think I would have supported the study, yes.
Okay.
And I know there's been some controversy on both sides of this, but I do think you need to look at, and this is an opportunity to actually have an updated analysis of what, in fact, is possible for us economically. And if we commit to something like this, it has to be sustainable. And if we're committing to something that's going to really make it very difficult for us to deliver other government services, then that's an issue. And that's why I think it's important to really look at this on its merits. And then you've got the I-93, expansion, which is significant for the southern tier, both for business as well as, tourism. And that needs to be completed, and that needs to be funded. And I would support funding that through, debt service or debt financing, not operational, basically general revenues or operating revenues.
I guess I don't see a great difference between highway projects and rail projects in the sense of them being unsustainable. I mean, a highway system needs to be, I'm sure you're not operating trains over it, obviously, and so you don't have those infrastructural costs, but you have to replace it, you have to do the bridges over, you've got long-term costs and commitments to it, and that's not really necessarily paid for.
Right.
And the commuter rail system, as it relates particularly to this area, is seen, I think, largely by the business community as one of those things where it would really be a shot in the arm, and would help greatly continue the growth of this area, which I think a lot of people believe is the economic engine of the state, and it's one of those things where it ought to get done regardless whether it's sustainable or not.
Yeah, I'm not there to say that regardless of whether it's sustainable or not. But I also, like I say, have not closed the door to this. I think we need to look at it. And we have a new reality, right? And we're in the post-Great Recession or post-financial meltdown economy. What are the opportunities? And there may be more interest than there was before when we were looking at this from the point of view of passengers who might want to actually avail themselves of commuter rail rather than always having to drive themselves to work or go down to Boston and vice versa. So there's a reason to take a look at this now, I think, from a 2012 perspective. And I certainly would be open to that. And then seeing what case can be made and what level of interest there is in the business community to help support this. When I say public-private partnership, I don't mean simply the federal government and the state government working with the city of Nashua. I'm also looking at what kind of interest there might be in business for our large employers, for example, to see whether or not this actually would be beneficial to them to have in place.
How do you get there without doing the study? I mean,
Well, that's what I mean.
If you were elected governor, would you work with the executive council to revisit that issue?
Yes. Yes, I would. Yeah.
What about healthcare? If talk a little bit about what you would pursue in terms of reform, whether we have the Affordable Care Act or we don't after this next election.
One of the areas of practice that I've been involved with for the last 14 years is hospital work. I'm outside general counsel at Catholic Medical Center, representing Catholic Medical Center in its demerger with Elliott Hospital, and then its resurrection into a new era here in Manchester. I've also represented Franklin Regional Hospital when it merged with Lakes Region General Hospital. So I have a fair amount of real-world experience in healthcare. And my view is this, is that currently the federal government distorts our marketplace to the extent of Medicare and Medicaid rules, regulations, and laws. And the private sector, private insurance, and basically the payment system we have mimics that, a lot of those rules and regulations. So we already have too much, I think, government influence on the delivery system. We also have done things to ourselves that make healthcare more expensive and have really run out of the state insurers who should be here competing with us. We went to a community rating system, took the risk out of essentially premium setting. We, continued to work under CON laws that again took some free market dynamics out of the system. I think we need a New Hampshire-based approach to reforming our healthcare system, not a Washington-based approach. I certainly would have been, if I were the governor, we would have been the first state to sue the federal government on Obamacare. Not only the individual mandate, but the initial proposal, which was to compel the state to turn over its Medicaid program to serve as that sort of portal through which uninsured individuals would get insurance or health insurance. Medicaid is not designed for the general population. It's designed for poor women and children, the disabled of our state, and senior citizens who don't have access to health care under other portals. To take that system and to expand it to 30, 50,000, maybe up to 80,000 lives of New Hampshire citizens is really taking a system that's not designed for that purpose and going to make it much more inefficient, I think, and expensive. What I would propose to do is to change our laws to allow for risk premium setting, remove the community rating system essentially, make it easier for people to risk pool, like businesses, for example, to enter into a risk pool to actually negotiate coverage for themselves, and then to get out from under the mandate paradigm that we have, which basically says there's a one-size-fits-all approach to health care, and let the employers design that health care coverage for their employees or the risk pool for its risk pool, to have a lot more flexibility there. And then to allow for riders to be added to a particular individual's plan if they need that. I think that's the direction we should be going into. And then finally, we need to work with our healthcare providers to find out from them what in fact works best, what are the best practices. And that means hospitals and community health clinics, as well as physicians and insurers, putting everybody in a room to design the system for us. I think the federal government needs to have less of a role frankly, in healthcare than more of one. And Obamacare proposes to have much more of a role. So when it comes to the question of whether New Hampshire should opt in or opt out, I'd say opt out with the caveat. We should try to get a waiver of the maintenance of effort requirement under existing Medicaid system so we can alter it and modernize it as best we can. And then ask the federal government, based on some minimum standards we'd set, to fund the delta, the increased monies they would be paying if we had turned over our system to Medicaid, and have us design a high-risk pool as the portal by which uninsured individuals would have access to health insurance through private insurance, and then set up a private insurance exchange essentially to work in conjunction with that high-risk pool. And I think that would be a much better model for us. It would be much more flexible. And we could account to the federal government to the extent we have to say, those dollars that you've given to us in this alternative method are achieving the following things that you are looking to achieve in terms of increasing the number of people who are actually accessing health care through insurance.
Well, as you know, we've had high-risk pools in this state, and they haven't been very successful.
Right.
We did many of the things you talked about with regard to community rating when Craig Benson was governor, and then we repealed those. What's different about the market now that's going to create the momentum for these kind of changes?
I think very much the market sees something happening that it's going to adjust to. And what's happening is if we simply go along with the Affordable Care Act, we're going to find ourselves in a single-payer national health insurance system. That's what the design of the planners is. Because it's going to be unsustainable to continue to have private insurance working under this model. People will elect to pay the tax and then avail themselves of the Medicaid portal if that's the system that continues to provide that health care. So for physicians and hospital leaders who don't want this, for insurers who want to continue to compete, there's much more of an impetus, a call to action than there ever has been. I've never seen the kind of, well, at least overture by hospital leaders, for example, and healthcare professionals to want to work together because they recognize they need to change their model if they're going to succeed here and offer an alternative to where the overall national direction is heading us. So I'm encouraged by that. And one of the first things I would do on day one is launch that healthcare task force with some of these important stakeholders to start designing that New Hampshire system and get buy-in from as many constituents as we can for the way we would do or deliver health care as opposed to what another state might do.
The first time yesterday I heard a hospital administrator suggest that they would be willing to provide the health care for certain businesses. So thereby going around the insurance companies altogether and saying, you pay us essentially some portion of what you would typically pay the insurance company, less the efficiencies that this creates,
right,
where you have to send your employees to us.
Right.
I thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, it is interesting, and that's exactly what's happening. That goes to Kevin's question. What's different about us today in 2012 and 2002? Hospitals are thinking out of the box like that. And you know what we don't have, Terry, in healthcare right now is this working relationship that incentivizes people to lead healthier lives because they get something out of it. For example, lowering your cholesterol rate should have a direct impact on your premium setting, and it doesn't. Or, losing weight or exercising and getting employers to have and employees to have skin in the game in terms of the outcome of health care, which is no longer simply just because you're sick, now all of a sudden you get health care. We're talking about lifestyle, we're talking about health care risk management, and that's an important imperative, I think, to bring into sort of the operational system here. And that would do that. I'm sure that hospital is going to have somebody overseeing that risk pool and helping those employees undertake things that may be different than what they've done.
They'll be here weekly.
Yes, exactly. They'll be visiting very often.
What do you do?
Nick's blood pressure every day.
What do you do with regard to the cost of energy? Is this Northern Pass project ever doable, I guess, in your mind? Since obviously there's a lot of opposition to what you're talking about.
Well, the cost of energy obviously is an issue for business. It's more important, and it's a bigger item than, again, business taxes if you look at that New Hampshire Bankers Association survey. And we will be rolling out an energy plan here very shortly that talks about things that we need to do to remove some of the cost drivers. In terms of Northern Pass, first of all, there's no route right now. There's no formal plan on the table. So let's see what the plan is. But let's make sure that the developers and the proposals of the plan tell us in New Hampshire what the benefit is to us. No one's really ever quantified or articulated on behalf of the proponents of this. What does New Hampshire get out of this in terms of being the conduit state through which this power is transmitted? And I don't really care whether it's buried lines or put in some sort of low-lying pipeline or on towers. I do care about the towers, but regardless of the mode of transmission, what's the benefit to New Hampshire? Is it truly lower cost to us as a state, as the conduit state, different than other states? Or are we just benefiting in the attenuated situation of lower cost for everybody in the grid? I'd like to hear what the value is. I would insist on making sure that New Hampshire would have a power purchase agreement with a company that would allow us to purchase power at a lower than market rate and have a provision in that power purchase agreement that would provide that we would have the right of first refusal on that power in the event that the grid failed. Now, we don't expect the grid to fail, but we saw what happened in India. They had a massive power outage because the grid itself failed. And if that power is coming through New Hampshire, I don't know what the engineering requirements are for this, but we ought to be able to call upon that power to keep our businesses and our homes lit while the grid gets restored. But that needs to be an articulated statement that can be done. Those are the kinds of value-added mechanisms I would want to see articulated by the proponents. And then we can evaluate based on the plan and so forth whether or not this makes sense for New Hampshire. There's going to be a lot more work in terms of a site evaluation committee that will have to be established and will be established to review this. But in the end, there needs to be a value proposition for New Hampshire that would make sense for us as a state to be the conduit.
Well, there's that, but there's also requirements on the utility to provide a certain amount of renewable. So, yes, I see your point in that regard, but they still have these rules hanging over their head that they're going to provide a certain amount of renewable energy by a certain date, and there's just not that. You're not going to get that from solar. It's going to have to come from some major source, and hydro would seem to be the opportunity at this point.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
In going through your priorities that are listed up on your website, I didn't see any reference to safety net type issues, the poor, the disabled, substance abuse, things of that sort. What is the role of state government in terms of dealing with that aspect of the population?
Well, Nick, like a lot of issues that I campaign on, I speak from experience about this issue. My wife and I were foster parents in the late 80s, and one of the children put in our care was a 2-year-old baby who ended up being with us for quite a while. He's now 24 years old, lives in the community. He's a special needs young man, and I saw firsthand the real benefits of an organization like East of Seals, for example, providing early intervention services. They sent a wonderful case worker who's trained with young people and young children to help us teach our young foster son about how to eat and crawl and walk and develop the skills to function. Also, we work with the special education system, and we worked with the Medicaid system, and now adult behavioral systems. We need to make this a priority in terms of our budgeting. And it's not an easy area, but it's a critically important area. There should have been full funding of the waiting list. The governor didn't even propose funding the waiting list. And the waiting list, as you may know, is when children age out of the special education system and move into the community, that there would be resources available for them to the extent they need help. Some of them are less involved than others, but there needs to be an ability to transition smoothly and seamlessly from the educational setting to the community setting. And that's what the waiting list addresses. It's about budget priorities, and it'll be an important budget priority for me. But I also want to make sure that we're as efficient as possible in terms of that delivery system. And there's a lot of bureaucracy involved with this, but it is critically important for...
Do you think it was as much a priority as it should have been in the last 2 years?
No. That's why I commend the legislature for restoring some level of funding to the waiting list, but there's whether people like it or not, there was a law passed to fully fund it, and I think we should have honored that.
We're getting pretty close to time.
Yeah, but how, as you know, you manage this large law firm. They do a lot of lobbying. They lobby across a pretty wide spectrum of issues. How are you going to deal with that if you're elected?
If I'm elected governor, like any other individual I would expect would do this, I'm going to have to sever my ties with the law firm completely. I'd have no economic interest in what we've been working on as a firm in the past. I want to have a clean and complete break. That's the only way to be able to function and serve the people of New Hampshire. You have to be able to have a singular focus, and that's the discharge of the duties and responsibilities of the office of governor of the state of New Hampshire. Everyone comes to the office with some prior experiences and relationships, and you need to be assured that the person who you're electing can exercise independent judgment. And I think people who know me, who've seen me work in not just government but the civic and charitable world and in business, know that I know the difference between when I'm in the middle of a lawsuit and in the middle of negotiation of a contract with some employee or president of a not-for-profit organization. And I can distinguish those roles, and I'll be able to do that. And I'll certainly be vigilant about making sure people understand if I do have some conflict, if there is a conflict in some regard, to disclose that and to act accordingly. But I have no, I sense and feel no restriction in my ability to serve the people of New Hampshire if they entrust me with the responsibilities and the duties to serve as governor of the state of New Hampshire.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here. There's some things that we didn't touch on, or anything you want to leave with us before I go?
What I'd like to leave with you is that I'm a fourth-generation New Hampshire native. I grew up in the state during the Mel Thompson years, and I've watched a number of different evolutions of New Hampshire. I remember distinctly as a young boy going skiing and watching a lot of Massachusetts plates go by and people from out of state, and I remember somebody commenting in the car, and this used to be our attitude, I think, in New Hampshire. Welcome to New Hampshire, now go home. We want to preserve New Hampshire for ourselves because we jealously guarded the state, and there's still a lot of pride about our state. But now I say to people, come to New Hampshire and stay if you will. If you want to be part of us and live in our state, given the local control focus we have, given the high degree of citizen engagement, you want to live in New Hampshire, by all means, come and be part of us. The paradigm has changed, and the paradigm is also the same in that in the past we've had leaders work across the aisle, people working with each other, even where they didn't agree on a lot of issues. I want to be a governor who goes into the governor's office with my background in conservative positions and principles, along with my experience, and serves all of the people. And I won't use my party label as a barrier to access or a speed pass to access of the governor's office or the executive branch. And I truly mean that. I've worked with people, like I say, who don't agree with me on a number of things, but on those things we can agree on, let's work together. And that's the message I want the people of New Hampshire to know. I'll be there for all of New Hampshire, regardless of their party affiliation, regardless of the region of the state they come from, regardless of whether they're newcomers to us. We need to work together. And that's what makes New Hampshire exceptional, and we've seen that over the years. We need to kind of rediscover that again and lower the volume when it comes to partisan bickering and raise the achievement of working across the aisle and not to compromise. I want people to be clear about this. It's not about compromise. It's about finding common ground where it exists and working to get the job done. So that's the kind of governor I'll be, and I hope I can earn your support, and I hope that in the end we'll be able to truly make New Hampshire the best state to do business, the best state to raise a family, and the best state to live.
Okay, thank you very much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.